Good morning, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us for Teledyne ISCO's April Chromatography webinar, focusing on our introduction to the ACCQPrep HP150. Today's webinar is being led by Ron Lewis, our Chromatography Product Manager. It is being recorded and will be available to all registrants and attendees later on this week. If you have any questions or comments during the webinar, please utilize the chat function within the Zoom platform, and all questions will be answered at the end. At this time, I will turn it over to Ron.
Thank you, Tori. Good morning, everyone. I hope the day is going well, or is going to go well, or went well, depending upon your time zone. I'd like to spend a few minutes and talk to you about introduction of the ACCQPrep HP150, our newest offering in the preparative HPLC product line. Just to give you a general overview of the ACCQPrep product line, it's really designed for uncompromised performance while maintaining an intuitive user interface for operation. Some of the things that we've done in the HP150 model is we've minimized our delay, gradient delay, using high pressure mixing. We have a flow rate range in the 150 that goes from 1 mil per minute to 150 mils per minute without the requirement of changing pump heads to get to the higher flows. And we've maintained our drive to minimize bench space requirements, maintaining a system that's about 15 inches wide. And that's minus the column, so the actual footprint of the box is about a little under 15 inches in width. As far as intuitive operation, we continue to use PeakTrack, which was developed for our flash chromatography systems, to drive the preparative HPLC products as well. It's a touch screen display. Doesn't require any additional space for an external PC. Although it can be, if the system is networked, it can be controlled by a PC from your office, or it can be controlled using a iOS operating system device like an iPad, iPhone, or an iPod. And that software is on the Apple application store for free download. If you have an iOS device and you'd like to control it via that device, you can download that on the Apple Store. Some of the things that makes our system unique is on-the-fly gradient changes during the run. A lot of the preparative HPLC systems on the market, you have to build the gradient prior to starting the run. And once the run starts, there's no option to change the gradient if you see where you'd like to, either your compound came out and you'd like to just wash the column and go back and do the next run. And you can't do that with our system. Those changes can be made on the fly. The other thing is that we control the UV or UV-Vis, the ELSD, and the mass spec parameters all in a single method. So you don't have to have a series of methods built up for each detector and have those linked together. As I mentioned, we use PeakTrack software, and that's common across all of the ISCO purification systems. So if you have one of our other models of system, the learning time turns into a matter of minutes because of the similarity in the user interface. All of our racks are RFID read, so there's no opportunity to get racks mixed up. The system, when you insert a rack in the ACCQPrep system itself or the auto sampler, it automatically recognizes the rack type, and there's a predefined table that controls the volume, the tube volume, and the tube positioning. So there's no chance for error that's introduced at that point in time. We also have something that's patented that's active solvent and waste level sensing. It's really there to protect your chromatography. It senses when your solvents reach a point where, solvent reservoirs are low enough that you might start to pump air and mess up your chromatography performance. And so the system will stop and send you a message that it's low on solvent. Same thing with the waste container. When it reaches full, it'll stop the system and tell you that the waste container needs to be emptied. This standard system configuration is for 2 solvent lines for binary gradients. However, you can, and there's an option to add 4 additional solvent lines, giving you a total of 6 solvents to pump from. Just a minute on specifications. As I mentioned, 1 to 150 mils per minute. Pressure limits up to 6,000 psi or 400 bar. However, the user can define lower pressure limits. When operating with preparative HPLC columns, a lot of the column manufacturers recommend 3,000 psi or less, or 200 bar as a maximum to protect the column from collapse and voiding at the top of the column. And so that can be set by the user to protect your column if you so desire. Wave UV and UV-vis detection, we talked about that. The LSD detector is integrated into the unit, so it doesn't take up additional bench space. We mentioned the number of solvents, binary gradients, 2 solvent standard, and up to 6 solvents. High pressure mixing to minimize gradient delays. A linear gradient linearity plus or minus 1%. Sample introduction is a variable volume liquid load. There's a 5 mil loop that's standard. In addition, we have a dilute sample load pump for pumping on higher volumes. It uses a standard 15-inch touchscreen display. There's a fraction collector internally that holds 2 collection racks. And in mass spec options, we have 2 different models to select from, either 10 to 1200 Daltons or 10 to 2000 Daltons. Both units are auto switching between positive and negative ionization, and we have a choice of ESI or APCI interface. So some of the hardware choices on the 150 we're going to go into. There's 3 different automation options. There's a column select valve. There's a waste tube switching valve, and I'll kind of explain some of these as we go along. There's a large volume sample load pump, 3rd solvent modifier pump, a funnel rack for large samples, and we've introduced some full or half racks for samples that are on the auto sampler deck itself for automated injections. And we have some high recovery vials for the auto sampler that are used for that'll hold 33 milliliters of sample. Those are just for introducing samples onto the auto sampler. And we have some vial seals that will support use of volatile solvents such as methylene chloride if you choose to run the ACCUPrep system in for normal phase purification techniques. 3 different automation options, as I mentioned. One is called an auto injector, and that's this device here. It's actually built in. It's option. If you order this as an option, it's built into the ACCUPrep system. One of the things we found during some of our customer interest was that we found a lot of people using auto samplers, but what they were really doing was they were dividing a sample up among 3 or 4 vials because the vials weren't large enough, and so then they were injecting from the same sample in multiple vials. And so this is a less expensive option. It's very economical, takes up no space. What it allows you to do is program up to, I think it's 999 injections of the same sample without user intervention, and then goes through a injection wash at the end that where the user switches from strong to weak solvents to flush out the injection loop in the system. So it's a very economical option for people that want to have one sample and need to do multiple injections. If you have multiple samples for multiple injections, we have two choices of auto sampler, the AS 2x2, which holds 2 additional tube racks, and that is, so that would give you a total of 4 racks between the 2 that's in the ACCUPrep and the 2 that's in the auto sampler deck. And it supports one full sample rack or 2 half racks. I'll explain those in a minute. Or there's the auto sampler, the AS 4x2, which simply has 4 tube racks on the collection deck, giving you a total of 6 for the system. And again, it supports both the half and full sample racks. As far as I mentioned, here's the choices on sample racks. There's the full racks, and that's these long stainless steel trays you see here. This one holds 13 millimeter tubes, 28 of them. Over here is one that holds 28 millimeter scintillation vials or our high recovery vials that I mentioned a few minutes ago. It holds 12 of those. And then there's the half racks, which this is holds 6 of the 28 millimeter tubes, 14 of the 13 millimeter tubes, and one that's not on here, which we just recently introduced, is a 125 mil bottle option that has 2 sample racks. So if you have a large amount of sample, you can use that and don't have to split it up between multiple vials. And these white caps here are just an example of our sample tube with a white cap and an aluminum disc that seals the liquid so that you prevent evaporation prior to injection. The idea with the half racks is somewhat new. The ACCUPrep HP150 and the EasyPrep used only the full racks. This allows you to mix smaller samples and larger samples on the same auto sampler so that for unattended operation overnight. And we offer several different fraction collection rack options. All of these have been the same. All of these carry across from our flash systems through the EasyPrep and now the ACCUPrep. And most recent addition is the funnel rack, which has a rack for 12 positions, and it'll fit in any of the positions on the auto sampler and also internally into the ACCUPrep itself. And at that point, you can, in the software, it allows you to define the volume for the funnel racks, and then we track the volume that we've dispensed into each of the 12 positions. Column selector valve is also built in as an option if you order it from the factory, or it can be field, both it and the auto injector can be field installed if it's something you want to add at a later date. This is a standard column selection valve. It holds up to 4 columns, and I'll show you in a screen later on where you can program the different columns in each of the 4 different positions. Really allows you then to forget which position you put it in. You don't have to worry about that. We simply ask you to pick which column you want. The system knows which position that column's in, and it rotates the system around. So again, it's for really independent operation while you're either overnight or while you're off doing some more important work in conjunction with the auto injector or the auto sampler. Another recent addition into the HP150 is a waste tube switching valve. This came out of some of our customer interests, where when operating with the auto sampler, the customer would like to collect the waste from a particular sample in case something went wrong during the purification process and they need to recoup their sample from the waste container. And so this has 12 positions, and so when you're injecting with the auto sampler, the first 12 samples, if you inject from sample 1, it goes to waste port 1 on this valve. And so you can, and likewise, sample 2 goes to waste port 2. Since where you position this valve is really up to the user, we provide 50 feet of tubing and fittings necessary to plumb it up, so you can run a single common line from the ACCUPrep waste port to this valve, and it can be located close to your containers, and then they have short lines from each one of the 12 positions, or you can locate this close to the ACCUPrep and have a short common line and long individual port lines to the waste containers. But the big thing is it correlates waste container to sample position on the auto sampler. I mentioned the large volume sample load pump. This is a pump that has a flow rate range of 1 to 100 mils per minute. It can be controlled through peak track, and the only thing that's manually required is manual flush and prime to clean out the samples. What we provide, you can use whatever vessel you want for your sample to be contained in. We actually provide a 260 gram empty cartridge for putting your sample in. The nice thing about it is it has a frit in the bottom, so you get a last minute filtration of your sample so that you don't get particulate pulled into the pump. But you can use other containers if that doesn't work for your application need. And this sets typically on top of the ACCUPrep, and the valve over here on the right-hand side switches between loading the column, bypasses the sample loop, pumps directly onto the column, and so this valve switches from load to inject. So when you're running your sample, this pump stops, you then rotate this valve and then continue on. And the system sends you messages that says, okay, I've completed my sample load. We have some customers that are pumping on up to 1 liter of sample prior to starting their chromatographic purification process. So this allows you to do that, and at the higher 100 mil per minute flow rate, you can do that in 10 minutes or less. There's a third solvent modifier. Some laboratories I know have pure solvents that are plumbed into the system from a large common reservoir, and so they don't have the ability to add TFA to those samples. TFA would be an example of what you might use modifier pump for. And so this pump allows you to program let's say you have a dilute solution of TFA and you want to use that throughout your run. This allows you to pump up to 15% modifier. The pump has a flow rate maximum of 24 mils per minute. So it's an isocratic run during the entire run process. Again, it's controlled through peak track, requires manual priming and flushing, just like the large volume load pump. And again, this can set either on the side of the unit, on top of the unit, depending upon where you have where you'd like to locate it. And when you start looking with the ACCUPrep combined with the ELSD, the range of the automated delay time correction we've implemented. What I'm really trying to say here is on a lot of our competitive competitors in the preparative HPLC market space, when you change from one flow rate to another, there's a delay time between the signal that goes to the LSD and the signal that goes to the UV. And to compensate for that, you have to manually change the delay tubing. We've automated that process, so based upon whatever the flow rate is, we've internally we've adjusted the delay tubing volume so that the peak alignment is always correct without the user having to take that into consideration. And this is just some examples. Here's a run of 4.6 on an analytical column at 2 mils per minute. And you can see here that the green line is the ELSD trace. The other 2 lines are UV signals. And you can see that there's good alignment at 2 mils per minute. Here is a 10 millimeter column run at 5 mils per minute. And again, you can see here there's excellent peak alignment. Another one here is a 20 mil per minute column. And again, you can see there's good peak alignment between the peaks. And at 30 mils at 42.5 mils per minute on a 30 millimeter column. Again, peak alignment is the same. And we have been able to compensate for peak overlap between ELSD and UV from anywhere from 2 mils to 150 mils per minute. And this is just a 4-component test mixture that we use to confirm the accurate alignment of the ELSD and the UV signals. So no user intervention required to go from the 2 mils a minute up to the 150. And the system automatically compensates for it internally. Another hardware feature is obviously mass-directed purification. We talked about the 2 different options as far as detector models, as well as the choice of sample ionization probes. The thing is that you can monitor and collect on up to 6 masses or 5 masses in a mass range. We have an option to terminate on target, which allows you to reduce your purification time, saves you solvent. The mass spectra can be viewed in real time or post-run, and can be also included in post-run reports if you want to save that data for future reference. So, and that's what you see in the screen up here. This is a report screen, and down the lower part of the portion of this screen is the mass spectra information for one of the samples up above. Software features, we'll go through these. One of the things we're most excited about, and we had excellent feedback from our customers during beta testing, was our focused gradient generator. Obviously, if you have a lot of sample to inject, what you'd like to do is you'd like to get the maximum separation or an optimized chromatographic conditions so that you could get maximum loading. And so we'll step you through that. We've also introduced a reference chromatogram. Talk about that. Fraction overlay option. If you've got a well-defined sample and you want to collect it so that you only have 1 or 2 large reservoirs that you don't have to transfer a series of tubes into a common vessel to simplify the post-purification evaporation process. We've added auto increment in the Q screen. We've increased the number of time windows to make that we use in the overlays. We'll talk about the other 3 also when we get later on in the presentation. One of the gradient generator, as I mentioned, you'd like to optimize your gradient so that you can separate close eluting peaks at a maximum while minimizing your purification time. We've developed a simple 3-step procedure to optimize gradient conditions for a desired compound that the user selects. It's really useful when multiple injections are needed, obviously. It's simple. It calculates what I'll term close to optimum conditions. minimal user inputs required. Eliminates the need to program a series of focused gradients. That's what a lot of users do. They program a gradient from 10 to 20, another gradient from 10 to 20% A or B, and then another gradient 20 to 30% B, 30 to 40% B, and so forth. And then depending upon where their analytical, their compound dilutes on an analytical system, then they choose one of those focus gradients to run. It's not really the ideal way to do it. And so we've developed a way that you can use the ACCUPrep HP150 to do the analytical run and then follow that directly with optimizing the run conditions to do a purification run. And when you're using the 4.6 millimeter columns, we automatically do loop bypass after a certain number of injection volumes. We switch the loop back out of the flow stream to minimize and reduce the delay volume. You really probably don't think a lot about that, but when you've got a 5 mil loop in your sample loop in your flow stream, and you're flowing at 1 mil a minute, your gradient's automatically shifted by at least 5 minutes. So that's not a desirable thing. So we're trying to reduce runtime requirements so we switch it out of the flow stream to reduce the delay time. You can use a 4.6, a 10, 20 millimeter column to run a scouting gradient. You could really use a 30, but for all practical purposes, I think most people are using probably a 10 or 20 millimeter column on their system. So you can do a light load injection if you want on any of those columns, and then scale up the injection volume after you do the optimize the gradient conditions. So I mentioned this a few minutes ago. This is when you've got a column switching valve, you have 4 different column positions, and those are defined up here. And so as you add a new column and you define the position that it's in, one of the things you want to do is to build a gradient, default gradients. And so in addition to a default gradient, we've added a new button here called New Scouting Method. So for use of a method for focused gradient generation, you are required to define a new scouting method. And so if you push that button, you get this next screen that pops up that says it's going to run from whatever % B you put in here. It's going to generate a focus gradient that's plus or minus 5%. The drop downs are plus or minus 5%, plus or minus 10% around the optimum % B that is calculated. In this case, it picked up that if this is a 20 millimeter column, so preset the flow rate to 18.9. You can adjust the flow rate if you'd like. You can change the name of the method. The method is marked internally as being a scouting method once you click the new scouting method button. And so it will then generate a gradient, the default gradient that's used to do the first quick pass scout. That's a 6-minute gradient. And I'll show you that on the next slide. So once you've got that method built, and you simply go to the main screen on the system, you pick the column that you want to run, and you pick the method, and you select the scout method or whatever you gave this name for the scout method. And it'll automatically generate your 6-minute gradient from 10% B up to 100% B over 6 minutes. We've had some people want to change this time. It's not recommended to change this time. This actually gives you decent, very good quick scouting method. And this 6 minutes based on 150 millimeter long column. If you change the column length, it'll adjust the scouting run accordingly. One caveat I should put down here, that the scout and the prep column, if we're using an analytical column and then scaling up to a larger prep column, they must be the same media. So since we're using ready-set prep columns, they're all 5 micron, they're all C18. In this case, we're using a C18 in this example. So we run our sample, and this is what a typical gradient might be. So there's 5 different components in this gradient. And so this gray line here is actually the pressure. This is something that the user can turn on or off as an option, so you can monitor the pressure during the run. You can look at the UV on this screen. If you touch anywhere upon it, turn this on, it opens a little window below it. You touch on the screen where you want to see the UV. If we'd had a mass spec connected on this system, this MS button would be active. And we can go into this and we can zoom in if you want. But so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to select my target compound and the column size for purification. So that's my second step. So I've zoomed in, and first thing I want to do is there's a red line here. Just by touching on the screen, I pick the peak that I want to set as my target. In this case, we've selected this peak. Next step is to select the column that I'm going to use for the focused gradient. And then the last thing is to press the focus button on this screen. As soon as you do that, it'll generate a focused gradient for the column that you've selected. And this focus gradient is for a 150 millimeter column is 12 minutes long. And what our anticipation is that the peak of interest will come out pretty close to the middle of this chromatogram. And the last thing is to simply perform your purification. And this is the results that we got from that run. This is the compound that we were looking for right here, and it's pretty close to the 6 minute. In this case, it actually looks like it's almost on the 6 minutes. So it's that simple. Just select the scouting gradient, inject your sample, and then select your target compound and the column that you're going to use for your purification, and then perform your purification step. This is a real-life example that from one of our beta sites. This is the scouting run results, and this is the DMSO peak. This compound here is their target compound. You'll see there's, if you blow this up, this is actually slightly separated as a front peak. And so what they simply did was they marked this peak as the target compound. And this is the method that was generated, the sample was run, and this is this little peak that's just barely separated from the target compound. Nice baseline separation. And you can see that this is a much higher loading on this run. So very easy for the user, very powerful system, and it was really something that generated a lot of excitement in our beta test sites. Reference chromatogram is something that's been asked for from time to time, and the real purpose of it would be to pull up a previous run and display that run in a window up above here. And then this is your runtime window. And so you can zoom in either one of these two, and it will carry over the same conditions. So if you zoom in this window to look at 0 to 5 minutes, then it will zoom and show you that 0 to 5 minutes up here. If you change the attenuation, it'll change the attenuation to match here. One useful thing is if you've got a test chromatogram that you've run on your column, you can pull that up here and then rerun your test chromatogram again after you've used the column for a while to to make sure the column's still performing as expected. But it's just something that's there. The user can decide when they want to use it. To access this from the runtime screen, you simply push the format graph, and one of the choices is to load a reference chromatogram. Talked about fraction overlays. This is a software, and I would warn you that it's only for well-defined samples. In other words, if you've got, it's excellent for chiral purification applications where you've got two compounds in your test mix, and you want to separate in your mixture, and you want to separate those from one from another. The objective is really, as it says here, to minimize the number of fractions that you collect, so you don't have to pour a series of tubes back together. So we use the time windows to identify the tube, and peak track will determine when the tube is full. And this is an example of this down below here. There's two time windows here, one here and another one here. They butt up against one another. As I mentioned earlier, you can have up to 6 of these. So they don't have to butt up against each other. You could put a time window to collect this peak, time window to collect this peak, and all of these other peaks will go in between. In order to prevent getting the overlays out of alignment, we only collect the first peak in a time window. So you can see maybe this would be a peak that might be collected. We stop the collection right here. This peak is not going to be collected because that would generate a third tube here. And so peak track tracks when a tube is full. And so down below here, you'll see on the first run, we used tubes 11 and 12. And then on the second injection, we still had room in tube 11 to collect additional sample. We collected some in tube 12. 12 became full, so it started putting the rest of the material from the second peak into tube 14. And then on the third injection, 11 was full, so it started putting sample into 13, and it continued to fill 14 on the third injection. And so this is 3 subsequent injections on the system, and you can see that how we manage the tube. So it always reserves a tube. So once 13 is filled, it'd go to 14 or 15 for the first peak, 16 for the second peak, and so forth. So if you've got 6 time windows set, it'll set aside 6 tubes, and so for collection of each one of the 6 peaks. And then when tube 1 is full, it would go to tube 7. And you can use that with test tubes. You can use it with bottles. You can use it with the funnel rack, whichever ones you fits. It has the volume to fit your requirements. Just to mention some other software features, there's the auto increment in the Q screen. As you're staging samples for use on the auto sampler, typically the column and the sample information is pretty much the same from one run to the next, and so all that information is copied down as long as incrementing the sample position. The sample volume is copied down, so that then those lines can obviously be edited, but it's just a way to make it easier so that there's less user interface requirement. So if things stay the same, you don't have to edit anything, or you don't have to add information in. It's pre-filled for you. There's automatic loop bypass. We talked about that. It's after a defined time, it's switched out of the flow stream. It's really important with the 4.6. Probably the 10 millimeter columns would make a significant difference as well. Once you get to the 20 and 30 millimeter columns, not quite so important. And then finally, we had some customers that asked us for a no inject, no collect option. Use for this is really at the end of the day, the user wants to run a flush method, maybe to clear the modifier out of their column. And the way that the system used to work, the ACCUPreps and the Combi Flash systems, was that you had to have a fraction collector rack and you had to make an injection. And so you can build a method now that's just a wash method, what's truly a wash method, and turn off injection and collection. And so when that method starts, it just starts to run, flushes the column out, shuts the system down. So those are our new options in the HP150. We're very excited about the product. We're very excited about the software. We think that the focus gradient generator will really be a time saver for our user base. So I guess we'll try to see if we can answer some of the questions that have come up.
Yeah, and if you have any questions, now would be the time to use either the Q&A portion of Zoom or the chat function within Zoom. And while we wait to see if any questions do come in, I do want to let you guys know that our upcoming topic for our webinars in May will be more discussion on the automated gradient optimization. That webinar is going to take place on May 23rd. So mark your calendars and you will receive more information around the 1st of May on that particular webinar.
Yeah, glad Tori mentioned that. I should have remembered that, but obviously I didn't. But that webinar is really going to cover a lot about the mathematics and the calculations behind our gradient generator, so that you can get a better understanding of how we're doing it. It's not like a magic wand. It's actually based on some really sound chromatographic principles. One question that I've got received was when is the HP150 going to be available for sale? I can tell you it's available today for purchase, and we will have systems ready to ship by the end of this week. So we should be out of the gate with a shipping schedule that has got about a 3 or 4 week lead time, effective immediately. So I think that's good news. Another question was concerning the HP125. That product is discontinued and it's being replaced by the 150. There just isn't a significant number of differences between the two to carry the two options. And at the same time, if you have an HP125, almost all of these features, software features, are available in the 125, and that software, new version of Peak Track, will be available in the next couple of weeks. That can be downloaded from our website in probably 2 weeks or less. But we'll send a notice out to our field sales and service people when that software is available, so they can let you know. Any other questions that come up?
And just a reminder too that this will be recorded, or it is being recorded, excuse me, and will be available through Teledyne ISCO's YouTube page later on this week or early next week. Once it is available, you will receive a notification so that you can go ahead and view that and share that with other colleagues if you would like.
Okay, I don't see any other questions coming in. So again, thank you very much for your time. I hope you found it informative. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact us here in Lincoln, Nebraska, or your local salesperson for further information.
Great, and thank you to Ron for walking us through this new product introduction today. I think we've covered a lot of great information. So thank you to everyone and have a great rest of your day.